and welcome to This Explainer. Let's just jump right into it. You look around today, and man, pop culture is absolutely saturated with sex, right? It's in our feeds, our movies, our ads, literally everywhere. But the reality of human sexuality, it goes way beyond what's just on a screen. It's this massive, deeply fascinating journey that actually shapes who we are at our core. Today, we're unpacking that whole journey, going all the way from our internal identities right out to how we build actual intimacy with other people. Which brings us to a really fascinating paradox. How can something that drives so much of our human connection also be the source of so much, well, confusion? I mean, on one hand, sex is this profound source of pleasure, satisfaction, and obviously reproduction. But at the exact same time, as the source material points out, it can be a huge source of guilt, immense confusion, a pathway to infection, and, unfortunately, sometimes even a tool for coercion. Figuring out this duality, that's the real key to understanding ourselves. So, to untangle this giant topic, we're going to take it step by step. Here's the roadmap for today's explainer. First, decoding identity and scripts. Second, how we learn about sex. Third, sexuality across the lifespan. Fourth, navigating adult relationships. And finally, sexual health and responsibility.
All right, starting off with Section 1, decoding identity and scripts. Basically, who we are and how society expects us to act.
You see, our sexual behaviors don't just happen in a vacuum. They are heavily dictated by internal identities and these massive external societal expectations. To see just how skewed our perceptions can be, let me ask you a quick question. How large do you think the gay, lesbian, and bisexual population actually is in the United States? Just, take a guess in your head. Well, according to Gallup research, the general public drastically overestimates this. Women often guess it's roughly 30%, and men usually guess around 17 to 20%. But get this, the gap between our perception and reality is honestly staggering. While the public thinks the number hovers around that 20% mark, actual data from the National Survey of Family Growth reveals that only about 4.5% of the adult population identifies as LGBT. It is a brilliant, totally eye-opening illustration of how our cultural conversations can wildly misalign with statistical reality. Okay, so if our perceptions are that skewed, what's actually guiding how we act? That brings us to a huge concept, the sexual script. This is basically a set of societal expectations about how you're supposed to behave sexually based on your gender and orientation. Think of these scripts as the ultimate blueprint, the who, what, when, where, and why of our behavior. In fact, sociology suggests that these invisible scripts often guide us way more than our own actual lived experiences do. Crazy, right? Now, historically, we leaned hard on traditional scripts. These were super gendered, very male-centric, hyper-focused on orgasm, with guys expected to be the assertive initiators and women expected to just be passive. Compare that to today's contemporary scripts, which are way more egalitarian and focused on the relationship itself. Today's scripts emphasize mutual pleasure and basically say, hey, either partner can initiate. But we do have to critically point out that a double standard absolutely still lingers today. Women are still routinely judged more negatively than men for their number of sexual partners. And for those stepping outside those traditional heterosexual scripts, finding your identity is a real multi-step psychological journey. It usually kicks off in late childhood with step 1, mixed feelings, which often involve a lot of fear or denial. Step 2 is actively labeling those feelings of love or attraction as homoerotic. And then step 3 is the actual self-definition as lesbian or gay. The source material really emphasizes that this whole coming out process is deeply affected by gender, race, and age. And research shows it can be especially tough for ethnic minorities to navigate. Moving right along to Section 2, how we learn about sex. Let's look at socialization from childhood through young adulthood. Because clearly, we aren't born knowing these sexual scripts, so where are we actually picking them up? Well, looking at our primary influencers, parents actually have pretty mixed results, mostly because teenagers are just too mortified to ask them direct questions. Interestingly, though, younger siblings highly utilize their older sisters for advice. Then you have peers, who are a massive source of info but also misinformation, totally driving this pressure and bravado, especially among boys. And finally, media and digital spaces. This is huge today. It sets the normal for everyone, but for LGBT youth specifically, the digital world is an absolute lifeline for crucial info they might not be getting at home or school. And zooming in on parents for a second, there's this incredibly insightful quote from the text. Parent-child sexual communication is bidirectional, shaped as much by the questions introduced by the child as the intention of the parents. This completely shatters the old inoculation theory. You know, that idea where you just sit your kid down for one big, awkward talk and boom, you're done. The reality is, kids need frequent, ongoing boosters as they grow up and encounter new questions. All right, Section 3, Sexuality Across the Lifespan. We are tracking this from our early experiences to later life changes. So, we've covered the scripts and how we learn them, but how does this actually play out as we age? Let's start with adolescence. 17. That is the statistical anchor right now for the median age of first sexual intercourse for both males and females in the US. But while we're looking at median ages, we also have to impartially acknowledge a really sobering reality presented in the data. Nearly 1 in 5 women, about 18.8%, report having been forced by a male to have intercourse at some point in their lifetime. It's a stark reminder that early sexual experiences are absolutely not always voluntary. Now, for teens who haven't had intercourse, the landscape is definitely shifting. The concept of technical virginity is becoming way more prevalent. Basically, this means being sexually knowledgeable and experienced, but without actually having penile vaginal intercourse. The definitions of virginity are getting pretty blurred. And what's super interesting in the data is that the pride in keeping one's virginity, whether for moral or pragmatic reasons, is actually converging. It's becoming equally important to both young men and young women today. As we get older, our bodies change, and so does our sexuality. But the physical trajectories look pretty different depending on who you are. Men typically hit their peak physical responsiveness in their late teens and early 20s, and their fertility declines super slowly. Like, it can continue up to age 80. Women, on the other hand, hit peak sexual responsiveness a bit later, usually in their late 30s and early 40s. The text also points out a documented orgasm gap, where heterosexual women report experiencing fewer orgasms than men or lesbians. And while women do undergo menopause around age 50, it is crucial to clarify a big myth here. Menopause absolutely does not end a woman's sexual interest or activity. Moving into Section 4, Navigating Adult Relationships, we'll be looking at fantasies, marriages, and non-monogamy. Once we age out of adolescence, our parents and peers kind of fade into the background, and our adult partners become the main source for updating our sexual scripts. But a huge part of adult sexuality is actually autoeroticism. Get a load of this stat. 60 to 90% of adults report fantasizing during sex. Fantasizing is incredibly universal. But those old societal scripts still influence our internal worlds. Research shows women's fantasies tend to be longer, leaning heavily on emotional and sensory imagery, whereas men's fantasies are more commonly focused on the direct action of doing something sexual to someone else. Now, when we look inside long-term marriages, we see another major shift. Roughly 14 to 15% of marriages are entirely celibate. It's really important to understand this because marital sex frequency naturally drops over time. And a celibate marriage doesn't automatically mean a lack of love. It very often stems from things like chronic illness, competing demands for time like work and raising kids, or honestly, simply a lack of novelty over the years. At the same time, adult relationship structures are totally expanding. Surveys show that a massive 80% of Americans still believe extramarital sex, meaning secret cheating, is completely wrong. However, there is a substantial documented increase in consensual non-monogamy, or CNM. We're talking about open relationships, swinging, polyamory, and monogamish setups. These are transparent, mutually agreed upon non-monogamous relationships. It just goes to show that contemporary adults are actively out there rewriting traditional relationship scripts. And that brings us to our final stop, Section 5, Sexual Health and Responsibility. How we overcome dysfunctions and protect each other. Look, maintaining an active, healthy sex life means navigating a whole host of physical, psychological, and ethical challenges. First things first, we really have to normalize sexual dysfunctions. Experts believe that only about 10 to 20% of dysfunctions are strictly structural or physical. The vast majority actually stem from psychological causes, things like depression, guilt, or very specifically, performance anxiety. This fear of failure is literally the most important immediate psychological cause of erectile dysfunctions in men and orgasmic dysfunctions in women. It is a wild testament to just how powerful that mind-body connection really is. Then, of course, there is the physical reality of sexual health. 20 million. That is the estimated number of new sexually transmitted infections, STIs, every single year in the United States alone. That's a massive number. And the text makes a very clear, very stark point here. Just because someone looks nice, or they're well-dressed, or they seem totally healthy, that gives you absolutely no guarantee that they are STI-free. Because of that reality, we have to talk about the core tenets of sexual responsibility. This means disclosing your intentions, making sure you're only engaging in mutually agreed upon activities, using contraception, practicing safer sex, being honest about any STI exposure, and, ultimately, accepting the consequences of your behavior. The source material doesn't frame this as some sort of buzzkill. It frames it as a respectful, ongoing dialogue. Practicing these things actually builds trust, and at the end of the day, it genuinely enhances true intimacy. Well, we've covered a tremendous amount of ground today, from the invisible societal scripts we inherit to how we learn them, all the way to how we navigate them through adulthood and relationships. So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Are your sexual scripts truly your own? Or are you just playing a part that was written by society? Take some time to think about that and evaluate your own socialization, because taking charge of your personal sexual journey really starts with understanding exactly where your beliefs came from in the first place. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.